Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back from lunch and being so prompt. I really appreciate it, and I hope our speakers, when we have our panel, will also be prompt and keep to time. So thank you very much. My name is Anya Sitharam, and this session is the Responding to an Unprecedented Global Food Crisis and Averting Famine. I'm a former BBC World News presenter and now work behind the camera as a documentary producer and also a conference host. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator. Before we start, I've got to do some housekeeping tips. So let me tell you what you need to do. So we have interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. And we also have the Wi-Fi connection. There's the passcode there if you want to get online. We are going to be using Slido. Oh, there. Also, please also post your... I'm trying to keep up with the graphics here, so I'm not saying the opposite. Do tweet. There you are, EHF 2023. And then I think they're going to show... Oh, there's the interpretation again, just in case you forgot. English, French, and Spanish. Slido. Now, for those of you watching online, there will be an opportunity to post your questions later on in the Q&A. For those of you in the auditorium, it would be great to hear from you in person. But before we start our panel, I'm going to ask everybody for their opinions on Slido. So please go to Slido now. The event code EHF 2023. Okay, that's the housekeeping done. So let me just put this session in some kind of context. Let's frame it. We know the world is facing a serious setback in efforts to end hunger, conflict, the climate crisis, and the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, compounded by the war in Ukraine, are turning a crisis into a catastrophe. Those aren't my words, but those of the Global Hunger Index. Acute food insecurity has doubled since 2016, but the funds, we know, are not keeping pace. So in this session, we're going to be looking at three different regions, the Horn of Africa, Sudan, and Yemen, all facing some of the highest food insecurity in the world, and all characterized by different and yet occasionally overlapping drivers. And we're going to discuss whether the response by humanitarians and the international community is working and what should be done to improve it. Let me introduce now our distinguished panel of speakers who are going to be discussing the causes and assessing the response. Sitting here, we have Abdirahman Warsame, who is the Special Envoy from Somalia for Humanitarian and Drought Response. Next to him, we have Jean-François Riffaut, who is the Director General, Action contre la faim, or Action Against Hunger. We also have Sarah Charles, Assistant to the Administrator for USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And we have Rina Galani, United Nations Famine Prevention and Response Coordinator. And sitting at the end, we're pleased to have Sesuma Samate, Commissioner for Political Affairs of the African Union Commission. Welcome to you all, and I look forward to hearing from you shortly. And we also have a graphic recorder, Sergio, who's going to draw a graphic summary of the session, which will be available later online, and we'll be able to see how he's progressing later on. So I said go to Slido, so I hope you are doing that. And we have a poll now. We're going to ask you a couple of questions, and you're only allowed to answer one question per poll. You're allowed to vote on one, because you might think, oh, I'm not sure between the two answers, but I'm going to make you just choose one. Okay, so the first one is, food crises are increasingly complex. How does this affect the response to be provided? So food crises have essentially changed in scale. We only need to upscale the response. We need to develop tailor-made strategies using traditional humanitarian responses, which remain largely valid, or we need to adopt tailor-made strategies and fully rethink the humanitarian work adopting new approaches and instruments. So let's see how you are doing and what the vote says. Okay, so you want to turn everything upside down. There's a pretty 86% of you want to do that. We want to adopt tailor-made strategies and fully rethink the humanitarian work. I wonder what our panel will make of that. Now, the second vote is food assistance does not grow at the same pace as hunger does. What is the best way to fill the funding gap? We need to increase resources. Traditional donors need to make an extra effort, and new donors need to take a step forward. We need to use resources more efficiently, or we need to move beyond and mobilize new sources of funding from financial institutions, private sectors, etc. Let's see how you're doing. Oh, right, okay, well, they're not quite so different this time. More agreement there. So I think we're very much in favor if we need to move beyond and mobilize new resources of funding from financial institutions and the private sector, etc. But we need to use resources more efficiently is there, and I think there's a lot of agreement there. But yes, over 50% of you, again, think we need to move beyond and mobilize new resources. So rethink, mobilize new resources, absolutely revolutionize, transform everything. Okay, so we're going to come to our panel now, and we're going to start with a bit of a geographical, well, let's say a geography lesson, but a bit deeper than that, because we're going to look at the causes, and we're going to look at the situation on the ground. And I'm going to start with the Horn of Africa. In drought-affected areas of the Horn of Africa, over 32 million people are acutely food insecure, and the threat of famine is lurking in Somalia. So, Mr. Abdirahman Wasame, what do you think distinguishes the food crisis here from other areas?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving us this opportunity to address that issue. And I see that first time gender imbalance, we are doubled, isn't it? When I discuss about Horn of Africa, particularly Somalia, food insecurity, there's a lot of factors that contribute to the food insecurity, starting from the fragility of state institutions to respond to the crisis, the drought, which is unprecedented in the history of Horn of Africa, particularly in Somalia. We have almost 6 consecutive failed rainy seasons. And in the history of Somalia, this since 40 years, it is biggest drought that happened in Somalia. And also conflict is another cause for which contributes to the food insecurity, whether it's clan conflicts or terrorist-caused conflicts. We have dealing as Somali government the most notorious and ruthless extremist group, Al-Shabaab, which has causes food insecurity because they deny farmers to access their lands, and also the local community to exercise freely their livelihoods. And also there's another global crisis, which Ukraine war, which has caused skyrocketing food, fuel, and fertilizer prices. And in addition to that, also we face the challenges of climate change, which is devastating to us. We are the Horn of Africa people, particularly in Somalia, less contribute to the effects of the climate change, but we face it is a dire consequence, or whether it is a drought, whether it's rising sea level, whether it's other shocks of climate shocks, without having any access to the climate justice finance to deal with that. So the causes are so many, ranging from fragility of institutions to the climate change.
Incredibly complex then, and I also mentioned there's a threat of famine lurking. If you can be very briefly and talk about that.
Famine, last year we luckily averted famine, which were about to happen, and thanks to the donor community, particularly the United States, who contributed more than half of the funding to avert the famine. And also the Somali government has provided a leadership and all those who are working on the ground, implementing agencies, United Nations agencies, and other international and local NGOs. Together we did a great effort to prevent the famine. But still, as long as the 60 rainy season is going to fail, still the famine is knocking our doors. But the issue here is, we all that years are dealing with the emergencies and the symptoms of the subject, but we are not dealing with the root causes. For instance, since the Somalia known famine in 2011, which has cost lives of 280,000 of Somalis. Since then, the international community has spent in Somalia close to the $8 billion, and still we are facing the crisis. I would say if we spent half of that money into the resilience and recovery, we would have better position today. Thank you.
Right, we'll discuss the response shortly. I'd now like to invite Sesuma Samate to talk about Sudan, where about 1/4 of population, close to 12 million people, including refugees, are experiencing food insecurity. Ms. Samate, in your opinion, what characterizes the food and nutrition crisis in Sudan?
Thank you very much. You mentioned at the beginning, Commissioner for Political Affairs. This is my previous life.
Oh.
I was a Commissioner for Political Affairs, but now I'm the Commissioner of Health, Humanitarian Affairs, and Social Development. As mentioned my predecessor, the root causes in Sudan is the same like in Somalia. I will go in French if it is possible. My English, I'm trying my English, but I can go. Nous avons les 4 C. 4 C. We have climate change, conflict, cost of food, and also COVID-19. We have these 4 reasons impacted humanitarian aspect in Sudan. Is the root causes. But we have now, like what is happening in Southern Africa with Malawi, it's the same in East Africa, as mentioned the special envoy. And there is impact on a situation in Somalia, but Sudan, we won't forget the crisis. Since the departure of President Bashir, we have, but before that, I was working in Sudan, in Darfur. The situation continued. That impact also the food situation in Sudan became common thing, but it cannot be. The situation is worse, not only in Somalia, it's the same in Sudan, and also in Ethiopia, we have food insecurity in this region, and especially in Sudan also.
Thank you. That was very brief indeed. I'd now like to move on to our third geography, which is Yemen, which is a perfect storm of conflict, of the ripple effects of the COVID pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A severe economic crisis and access constraints has led to an escalating humanitarian crisis. So, Jean-François Riffaut, before we discuss the response, could you give your view on the drivers of that food insecurity in Yemen?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the chance to share my views on that. I'm afraid that I will be very banal in the description of the causes of the hunger and food insecurity in Yemen, because what characterizes the situation in Yemen is exactly the same that what characterizes hunger and food insecurity everywhere we find hunger and food insecurity. Maybe there is something specific in Yemen. It is the fact that there is, let's say, two governments. There is de facto authorities in the north and international recognized government in the south. But for the rest of the elements, for the rest of the drivers, it is so desperately obvious, and we are so desperately used to that. Conflict, years of war, people losing their life, and belligerent focusing on targeting markets. We all remember that back 2 years or 3 years ago, there was bombing of markets just to put people more in trouble than they already were. So conflict, absolutely total absence of safety nets, safety social nets, the weakness of the states, I put an S at the end, the weakness of the public system, of course, exasperated by climate change and by, of course, the COVID-19, but also by gender imbalance. So the terrible cocktail of hunger and food insecurity is exactly the same which is at stake here in Yemen than the one in Afghanistan, the one in Horn of Africa. And to be honest and to be direct, I think it does not belong to humanitarian actors to stop hunger, at least only. And to be honest, because we are all humanitarian professionals here around, we are not going to stop hunger alone. We are not going to stop food insecurity alone. The task is way too big, because it's not only a humanitarian task, it's a political task. So my ask today is to, and I enjoy seeing that most of you decided to choose the first sentence on the first question, is we have to challenge the humanitarian system. For sure, we have to improve. But what we have to challenge, it is the rest of the global community, which is not looking at the root causes of hunger. And so we are not going to start hunger. We are currently saving lives, but we are not addressing the root causes, because until hunger is not seen as a political issue, hunger does not belong to humanitarian actors. Hunger is not only a humanitarian issue, it's a political issue, which requires all the actors to commit, and not only humanitarian actors.
Thank you. We can come back to some of those points in the discussion. I'd now like to bring in, before we do that, we have a video of Yemen, which shows some of the response by the international and humanitarian community.
لما وديته مركز الصحي بدي يندوا لي تغذية، يندوا له علاجات يصرفوا له، بديته أنديله بدي يتحسن وضعه على ما كان. قبل كان مرة حد حقه عنده تغذية.
يعني في الوقت الحالي مع غلاء المعيشة يلا يكفي. الحوالات هذه اللي نستلمها من المنظمة يعني تنفع، يعني في حالة الضيق تفك لك الضيق.
أشتغل يومين في الأسبوع، صح إن أنا أشتغل بناء، أشتغل يومين في الأسبوع، والسلة هذا توفر عن مصاريف كثيرة، ولو قلنا على قدر المشقاية مش تكفيش حتى كسبور. هذه هي زي ما تقول فترة حرب، لو ما ينتهي الحرب شي يصير كل واحد يطلب الله على نفسه. وعلى أبوها له وعلى عائلته وعلى كل حاجة.
Some work there on the ground to try and alleviate some of that hunger, but it's a very absolutely impossible problem, as we've heard. I'd like to bring in Rina Gilani now. We've heard about the Russian invasion of Ukraine being involved in these food crises, and it's affected global food security around the world. What have we learnt about the interconnection of these food crises?
Thank you. So I think there's 3 key things that we've learned. Firstly, that if we think any crisis is localized today, we're kidding ourselves. We've now seen that these crises are interconnected directly to our doorstep and to all of us. I think the second thing that it's shown us that business as usual is just not working. And I think Jean-Francois and the Special Envoy and the Commissioner have referred to a number of things that perhaps I'll pick up on. We need a bit of a shake in how we're doing business. And I think the third thing is that it's not only the right thing to do right now, it's the smart thing to do. So just a couple of points on those issues. I mean, the interconnectedness we've seen from Syria, Afghanistan. If you look at Ukraine, we have seen, by the end of the year, I think the estimate is that global losses economically will be at 3 trillion. So full stop, we're all interconnected now in these crises. The good news is that there is really, the interconnectedness is hopeful. And we see the good dividends from it. So, we've lifted 1 billion people out of poverty collectively in the last 3 decades. We've actually ended famine in our lifetime. Unfortunately, the risk of it is back, but we have collectively done it, and that's because of our interconnectedness. And the third is just to remind us that Ukraine has not happened in a vacuum. We were already at one of, in our lifetime, probably a mega crisis that we're now all responsible to help the world out of. And I would say there, when you look at 222 million people not knowing where their next meal is coming from, this is the mega crisis of our time going forward. And we really need to start looking at that. So just a few points on where we should be looking, in my view. Firstly, there is the humanitarian. I mean, we cannot let people be starving and literally having children die as we speak. So early money, the SURF grant that the Secretary General released was a sign. It was early in the year, please be fast. And in Somalia, I understand on the humanitarian side, the humanitarians and the government will be out of money for the humanitarian response by March. And by April, good. So we need to provide that now, or we do have famine knocking on our doorstep. And as you know, last year, the US government was the main donor, the most significant. This year, we have to diversify. We all know that that is one of our big challenges on the humanitarian side. Secondly, the root causes, and that's where I think we should spend a lot of our time, Jean-Francois and especially Envoy. I completely think we're all on board there. What do we do? We're not naive. None of us are naive about this, but now really looking at what we do about conflicts is our challenge of our day, one by one. We are going to have to get the political will to start to make a dent there and start to look at how to shift the dial. 60% of food crises, as you know, are in conflict settings. Secondly, around climate, although agriculture is responsible for a third of all greenhouse emissions, only 3% of climate money goes to agriculture. That's one statistic. I'm sure we can all pull out many, many that show. And Somalia receives a minuscule amount, for example, of climate money, as well as other countries that should be receiving it. Those governments need it now. And that collectively is something we can start to do something together about. The third is really around finance. I heard the Minister from Sweden, Minister Folles, this morning, refer to the fact that it is now time for us to look at the financial system that we're in. Debt relief is urgent and pressing for the 60 countries that are on the verge of distress or in distress. Trade and how we trade is absolutely essential. It's not going to change without that. And there are some innovative ideas. I think it's working. We need to be supporting, etc., private-public financing. And the last I will refer to is the food systems that we have developed, and we really need to have a serious look at that. Firstly, of course, there's the issues around looking at diversifying exports in the immediate, imports in the immediate, looking at how we finance those, looking at fertilizers, costs, but also expanding who produces fertilizers. And then, of course, small farmer holders. And we know these are the solutions. So it's now about the conversation turning really to how we do that. And I'm mentioning one quick thing because in the food discussion, it's rarely mentioned, and it is a game changer, and that is gender and food systems. Women produce 60 to 80% of the world's food. And without really looking at how we have transformative change on gender equality, we will not resolve this. We know where the indicators for gender equality are better. There is less hunger and less poverty. So that is, I'll leave it on that, but it is really central to us changing the dial on these issues for people.
Thank you very much. Sarah, Charles, we heard about the intervention of America to help avert a famine last year. But despite the efforts of the international community to respond to the global food and nutrition crisis, the funding gap, which we've heard so much about, keeps widening. So what do we do about that?
Well, I think first we need to acknowledge that we are in an extraordinary moment. I mean, you mentioned at the start that needs had increased 50% since 2016. I think when our family and early warning system, a system that was put in place kind of following the mid-'80s famine in Ethiopia, and that we've used to really sound the alarm early when we see food insecurity on the horizon. Our famine early warning system estimates that we've actually seen a 70% increase in the most severe forms of food insecurity since pre-pandemic levels, a truly extraordinary deepening of need. And we've responded with extraordinary resources. We've put in, as the US, $1.8 billion last year. That was 85% of the total response in the Horn of Africa. We've put in $1 billion this year. That's 90% of all donor funds this year, 90 of all donor funds that have gone into the Horn this year. This is a dramatic shift from just less than a decade ago, when there was the specter of famine in 2016, 2017. We had a, if not global response, we had a diversified response to that. The US proportion of that response was more in the 30% range compared to the 85-90% range that we see right now. Some of that is because in the United States, thanks to the advocacy of many of the NGOs that are in this room, we have been able to draw attention, use the crisis in Ukraine, the very real humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, to draw attention to the interconnectedness that Rena talked about, the global impact of Russia's war in Ukraine, but also how it was compounding conflict and climate effects that pre-existed that war, and have used that to mobilize additive resources that could be deployed against the most acute needs globally. But that was really, those investments, particularly in places like the Horn, but also in the Sahel, in Yemen, and elsewhere, were meant to buy time, to save lives and buy time. And I think, as Abdi Rahman has talked about, we have seen in Somalia that has bought some time, but there's been tremendous suffering in that time, and there's still the specter, there's still danger ahead. So there's still very much the need, what we heard this morning about diversifying, bringing more actors into the response. It's also about how can we collectively be more targeted and have greater efficiency and effectiveness in the investments that we are making in these spaces, really driving resources to where the needs are most acute, where they're most needed, and that requires data sharing among partners, that requires stronger coordination systems, better collaboration between governments, between local actors, between the UN system. And it also includes coordinating with actors that we're not so used to talking to. And it's why I'm eager that Rina is in the role that she's in, because we do have in places like the Horn instruments that were developed after learning from the last couple of extreme drought seasons, productive safety net programs, social safety net programs, but they're not necessarily responding at the scale that's needed. They didn't come online fast enough when they were needed. And I still don't think we have good models as a humanitarian system of coordinating and targeting with those systems. In addition to the kind of what I think everyone on the panel has called attention to, in addition to really looking at what are the models to get climate adaptation resources into the environments at a very local level, where they can reach those that are most likely to be impacted. The current climate financing architecture is very much geared towards states that are best placed to ask for money, not states that are best placed or most likely to see the greatest impacts of climate. And so, again, I think the poll reaffirmed kind of the diagnosis, the need for new models, and our work is really digging in on what those models could look like.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes left to have a discussion amongst the panelists. So I'd like to bring in Ambassador Sasuma again. I'd like to talk about solutions, actually, and how we should be working on the ground and how donors and the international community need to rethink. So given what's been said about not business as usual and we're not dealing with the root causes, do you have any comment about that?
Merci beaucoup. On a décrit les causes profondes de cette situation. Peut-être que je vous laisse prendre vos écouteurs. Merci beaucoup. Ayant décrit les causes profondes de la famine et des difficultés du Soudan, il nous faut aller vers les solutions parce que la situation est telle qu'elle est catastrophique avec la malnutrition, les enfants qui sont dans des difficultés. Et qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire parce que c'est devenu un problème, pas uniquement pour les Soudanais, mais pour les acteurs aussi qui travaillent au niveau du Soudan. Et maintenant, parlant, qu'est-ce que nous pouvons trouver comme solution à cette difficulté? Je vois 3 ou 4 pistes. La première piste est d'investir dans l'agriculture. L'agriculture nous paraît vraiment importante. Nous avons des stratégies. On a la déclaration de Malabo qui dit qu'il faut mettre 10% de nos ressources pour l'agriculture. Il faut aller vers cela. Et aussi, il faut trouver la terre. Il y a une des panélistes qui a dit que ce sont les femmes qui contribuent le plus, qu'on puisse permettre à ces femmes aussi d'accéder à la terre, d'avoir les moyens de production pour produire beaucoup plus. Je vois quelque chose aussi comme piste de solution, c'est le transfert des technologies. Les pays, on parle des fertilisants, des engrais. Nous, pour 1 hectare, il nous faut un sac. Ailleurs, il faut des dizaines de sacs. Et ça fait qu'on produit beaucoup plus. Il faut aller aussi vers ce transfert. Et quelque chose que je vois aussi, c'est le commerce intra-africain. On a la chance d'avoir le thème de cette année sur la zone de libre-échange intercontinental. Cela aussi doit inclure la nourriture. Il y a des zones excédentaires, des villes excédentaires, que la nourriture puisse continuer puisse aller vers ces différents pays. D'un pays à un autre, d'une ville à une autre. Quelque chose qui me paraît aussi important, c'est le partenariat. Comment on peut avoir ce partenariat qui accompagne et surtout travailler ensemble? Parce que les acteurs sont sur le terrain, ils ne travaillent pas ensemble et cela ne favorise pas la solution. On a parlé de gap aussi. Le gap est important. C'est pas, je vois au Yémen, en Ukraine, partout, le gap est important. Comment on peut remplir ce gap? Comment on peut trouver une solution? Je vois d'abord les États membres, que les États membres aussi puissent apporter leur contribution au niveau national et au niveau africain et aussi dans le monde. Je vois ce partenariat aujourd'hui, nos États n'ont plus les moyens. Il faut aussi que le secteur privé s'investisse. Un partenariat public-secteur privé peut être une solution. Et je vois aussi sur le terrain, avec les agences du système des Nations Unies, l'Union européenne et d'autres partenaires, qu'on puisse ensemble travailler, coordonner. Ensemble, nous sommes forts. Ensemble, nous pouvons trouver des solutions. Ensemble, nous pouvons mettre fin à la famine sur le continent. C'est pour ça que l'Union africaine n'est pas restée à l'écart de tout ça. Nous avons réfléchi sur le thème de l'année 2022 sur la nutrition, comment trouver une solution. Et nos États membres ont élaboré et 14 États membres ont pu mettre en œuvre leur stratégie pour mettre fin à la nutrition. Et c'est le cas aussi du Soudan que nous encourageons à aller de l'avant. Voilà les commentaires que je peux faire sur cette question et merci.
Merci à vous. And I was going to ask everyone else to give a view, but we are now out of time on this section, and I have to be very strict and we move on. So perhaps during the Q&A you can get your other points in, hopefully. I'm now going to invite, we have 3 questions from the floor from the German government. Would you care to put your hand up? And someone with a microphone. Could someone please take a microphone to the lady in the 3rd row back, please? No, 2nd row, actually. If you could raise your hand, thank you.
Where is she? There. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Rather a comment than a question, really. Thank you so much for this very, very important panel. Germany has last year also given 4.8 billion on assistance for food security, and that is humanitarian and development money combined. And as it was said before, it is indeed not sustainable. There's a rather limited number of donors engaged, and this is not sustainable. And that is why I'm very grateful that the issue of root causes was mentioned so often. Yes, we want to and we need to broaden the donor base, and we are trying together with our partners. And Sarah, you know, we are talking about it all the time. How can we reach out? Who can we win over to invest more? But the root causes, it really is the thing. We need to find ways to shrink the needs. That's it, what we need to focus on all together. And that is why we really feel that we need to implement the nexus and live the nexus. Everybody has to be on board, and particularly the P in the nexus. We all know about the H and we know about the D, but the P in the nexus needs much more focus. And thank you also for raising the issue of political solutions that we need. And we also feel that it has a lot to do with ownership. Localization is key. People need ownership of processes, of political processes, peace processes. And that is why Germany is putting a lot of momentum into stabilization efforts. And I would also like to use this opportunity to invite everyone who has an interest in stabilization, please do reach out. We really think that this is a wonderful way of bringing in the local communities and really bring peace to areas of conflict, and thus also help prevent future famine and food crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Were there any more questions from the German delegation? No? Right, okay. In that case, I've got about, keeping to time, I've got about 2 minutes to come back to other speakers before we open the floor to some more questions. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that, about the peace-building, stabilization efforts. Would anyone care to comment on that? And also, Jean-François Riffaut, I was interested in some of the other solutions on the ground, such as social protection and long-term resilience. So perhaps you'd like to speak to that, and then someone else might care to speak about peace building. Thank you.
I'm not sure I will be very comfortable to talk about the peace building, because I think it does not belong to humanitarian actors to be involved in that. Even though I was in Chad 2 weeks ago, and I was discussing with the mayor of a very little hamlet, let's say, in the middle of Kanem area. And he was telling me, we are very acknowledging very much what you are doing for the young men in our community, because we are implementing vocational trainings to the young men. And he said, because for me it's important that those young men stay in the village and not go to be involved and committed to the Boko Haram dynamic, etc., etc. So on one hand, I'm a little bit cautious about the P in the nexus, but on the other hand, I have to be frank enough and honest enough to recognize that if we, as we are, and as we say that we want to listen to the communities, it is what they say to us. This is one point. The second thing I would like to add in a global picture of fighting against hunger, it's I think there is something missing, which is the private sector. Because at the end of the day, as we are humanitarian, we have to acknowledge also that the food system is facing troubles. And so we should assist food system the same way we assist vulnerable people, if you allow me to have this kind of analogy. The food system is not working anymore properly to address the food security, the global food security. And so, as you said, Rina, we have probably not to continue business as usual as humanitarian. But the food system can't continue business as usual. And I'd like to end on one point. We all remember the farm initiative in Europe following the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. It's great. I think it's great. But there is one thing missing in the farm initiative. It is challenging the way the food system is organized at the moment. 60% of people who are facing hunger on the planet are people who are producing what we eat. They are farmers.
Thank you very much. Let's see if there are any questions from the floor. So if you can raise the lights, put your hand up, please, if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll try and get a microphone to you. Have you seen one? Can I also say, if you want to ask a question, come down here so we don't have to run around the floor so much. Thank you so much. Right. Thank you.
I would like to thank the panel and the EU for this conference, which is very interesting. The crisis in the Horn of Africa or the Sahel is not new. So as you know, back to 1970, 1971, we faced the same issue in the past. And that has even led to the creation of a well-known institution right now. 40 years and 50 years later, we are talking about like almost the same thing, the same challenges with the same causes. So I would like to know, as a humanitarian actor, how did you learn from the past, and how do you incorporate this lesson in the new strategy we are talking about? Or do you think that we need to discuss or see the world differently, or to address the issue differently? I do think that if we look at back in the past, and if you can be able to learn from our failures. This is one of the questions. The second question, I'm glad I'm from Haiti. So I'm glad we're talking about like all the issues around the world with focuses on the Sahel, Ukraine, and there are two crises. At the same time, I try to understand why you, on what basis, for instance, you select to put the emphasis on certain countries and leave behind some others. And for me, this is not appropriate when you are talking about some of the humanitarian principles. So is it really a strategy? Because maybe tomorrow we might have another issue, another country, and you will leave behind Ukraine or the Sahel to start discussing to other countries without really addressing or making sure that the issues we are addressing right now are solved. So I would like to know on what basis you choose to put the focus on one country and leave some others behind.
Thank you very much. There's two questions there. Can take another question or two, and then we can... There's a lady at the front in red. If you can get a microphone to her, please. Oh, okay. Go ahead, and then we'll get the microphone to the lady at the front.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hello.
Can you give your name and your organization?
Yeah. Hello. My name is Ibrahim Modi. I'm the chairman for the National NGO Forum in Sudan. And I would love Her Excellency is talking about Sudan. Basically, when we look into the issues of food security in Africa, it's almost similar across most of the countries. I'll take the example of Sudan when we looking into the cause root of this particular hunger, and now we are counting over 12 million people are actually going through this famine. When we look back into, let's say, 2 years or 3 years back, the number was, let's say, 1 million, and now it's going high, of course, for a number of reasons. But my point here to the panels is that how we can invest on preventions, because what now people talking about is more of response, that how we can respond to the global famine. But if we look back, there was no like a global famine, maybe it's a few countries, and now every year we are having more countries coming to the list. I also disagree with the colleague from the German, not from the German, from is it Action Fame? Is it Action Fame, right? That peace is not related to the humanitarian. And I'll give you a very concrete example that in one of the countries, especially Sudan, that you find people depend on violence to get income, and we always have a fighting between pastoralists and farmers due to resources on the ground. So if we address this, then we will not have a famine because we will have stability for the farmers who will actually go on and do their work. And the other part also, the focus globally is on the food security, but we also leave the other part of the livestock. We have, livestock is also main source of the food security that support, the people on the ground, but it's always there's an issue of supporting that particular segment of the population. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And do we have a microphone here at the front, or where is the next? Yes, the lady in red wants to ask a question, and then we'll take some answers, please.
Ute Klammert, World Food Programme. Jean-François, I want to come back to your comment that the peace is a little bit to be seen distant from your humanitarian. I have to say that caused a little bit of irritation on our side because it's the opposite. I would argue it's the opposite, and we got the Nobel Peace Prize for that. So it's very important, actually also what the previous speaker was saying, that we are very clear what the P in the nexus means and how close we want to, and Heike Botzel, you mentioned that, how we want to address that. We have one principle to observe, that we as humanitarians have to stick to the principle of neutrality. So far, so good. And we are, some of the humanitarian organizations, we are certainly not, responsible for peace. That's a political issue. But we have to challenge our routine and ask ourselves, how are we contributing to peace? And how are we measuring that? So I would do exactly the opposite in terms of your approach. I would say we have to put P in the center of what we are doing, contributing to peace, being very precise about our roles and about our concept, and definitely
you know, using some of the other UN actors, but also the political parties and the political ownership for political solutions, and bringing all of that, what you're saying, connecting the dots. But I would see it as our role that definitely putting the UN resolution, hunger is a weapon of war, into the positive momentum, saying global food security is the pathway to peace. That's our role and our responsibility. Not easy to manage, with a lot of challenges on our side, also from a methodological point of view. I hope that is what you meant. But as long as we are clear that this is our challenge, then we have to, in a way, you know, exactly give that kind of feedback to our donors and saying, here are, you know, pockets of excellence, and here are windows of opportunity. Exactly, come in and negotiate that that element of peace in the nexus. Let me rather stop here, because that's our passion in the World Food Programme, really carrying with a lot of responsibility and proud the Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there's some very strong feelings in the audience there about where the P should be in the nexus. Let's briefly move away from that, though you may want to pick up on it. I want to see if you can answer the three main questions that have been asked. So back in the 70s, we had a similar crisis. What lessons have we learned from that? Why haven't we learned from that? Why do some countries appear to get chosen or singled out for assistance and others don't? And how can we invest in prevention? So I'm not going to pick on any of you. I think I'll just go through the line, and perhaps you'd like to answer whichever questions you feel you most comfortable to do so. So Mr. Wasame, I'll start with you. Would you like to comment on one of them? Perhaps, you know, how do we invest in prevention, for instance?
I think I agree with Gilani when she said we have to be very smart in this world, and particularly when we are referring to addressing the root cause of the problem. And we always deal and focus on the symptoms, which is emergency response to the situation. And that's why we are doing the same action every year. And we shouldn't expect different results. We conclude the same results. So to me, for instance, in Somalia, it is absolutely, and there's no, cooperation or between the development and humanitarian partners. They don't work together. My government's supposed to bring them together, but fragility of institutions of the government doesn't allow that. And they don't initiate to come together and work together. If I am becoming very smart to change as business as usual, we need the donor community and international community to build local institutions. The capacity of local institutions is very important. To set, number one, what are the priorities of that countries? What are accountability measures for those who are involved in humanitarian or development and activities? And also getting together that addressing the root cause together, whether it is climate, whether it's a peace. I'm not quite very ambitious about peace building, because peace building is involved in state building. And outside the wall and donor community, they don't really, I doubt that they are very much ready to put all those resources and energy into the building state institutions and peace building. So I would rather prefer investing in resiliency and recovery. That's easier than building state capacities, which is ideal and peace building. But given their lack of commitment in that sense, which we as Somalia facing last 30 years, which was containment, our humanitarian crisis, containment in conflict, whether it is terrorism, whether it is internal conflict, we were contained. But now what we need is we can't continue humanitarian response alone. We wanted to invest in the root causes, which is the real remedy, which is the, in resiliency and recovery. In addition to that, when you look at how the criteria surrounding to have access to climate finance, you may say fragile nations don't have any future here because it's very complex. We need that complexity to be easy, to be flexible for those who are facing the dire consequences of climate change, or those who doesn't have that capacity to have that access of the climate finance due to the complexity surrounding its access. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jean-François Rifo, what would you invest in? Oh dear, I shouldn't have asked him that.
Merci
You've only
beaucoup.
got a minute.
No, seriously, excuse me. I would love it. It comes from my low capacity in English, because I hope I would have been more precise if I would have spoken in French. But I don't think so. But more seriously, to make a step forward, I think the good word starts with a P, but it's not peace which is at stake. Of course, I join you and congratulations sincerely for WFP and Nobel Prize, sincerely, because I do understand, I do know, everybody knows that that's our goal, our common goal, whether we are UN agency, whether we are UN system or NGOs, our goal is to make things better, to make it short, sure. But the P, the other word which starts with a P, for me it's politicization. So please accept to hear politicization behind the P I used, the peace word I used. We have to stay away from the risk of politicization. Because we are sharing the same goal, which is to make things better for people and to make it short, we have not to be seen as working for any or other private or public or international interest, but the interest of people. Two last words. I was last week in Afghanistan, and I had a discussion with the Minister of Health, and I told him, Mr. Minister, we are humanitarian actors. We are not looking at regime. Otherwise, we would withdraw from many countries. We are just looking at people. So this is our goal. And I had a discussion 3 years ago with some advisors of the Président français, and I was telling him, please, if you want to protect us as humanitarian actors, we are talking about the north of Nigeria in Borno. I said, if you want to protect us, don't protect us. If you want to prevent us from being caught by ISWAP, etc., or other groups, please don't protect us. So this was my idea behind peace, and of course I join you on the fact that all we do is to bring peace to people. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah Charles.
So I'll take on perhaps the two questions from the gentleman from Haiti. The first around kind of what have we learned? I think there's a tendency, we as humanitarians rightly are a very self-critical group and we have miles to go, but I think it is worth acknowledging that there have been a lot of lessons learned. One, I think we're much better at early warning. Many of the systems, and I talk a lot about our response work, but USAID, BHA invest a lot in national weather services. We work very closely with EGAD and with others on developing regional and local early warning systems, sharing science from NOAA and NASA and kind of deep science partners in the US government, and that has improved greatly. It's why, unfortunately, we know there's still a specter of another failed rain in the Horn, and perhaps excessive rain following that one. And we've gotten much better at sharing and using that information. We've also gotten much better at understanding the role and investing in social safety nets. I mean, the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia is a direct lesson learned from the 80s and 90s. Even before the war in Tigray, even before the drought in southern Ethiopia, we were putting nearly $500 million a year into Ethiopia's social safety net program for the very purpose of preventing famine. And we know the kind of social safety net program that Somalia now has, that Kenya has. These tools are the result of learning. What we haven't yet done is put all of the pieces together. And as Abdul Rahman pointed out, coordination between these pieces still has a long, long way to go. I'll also speak to the question of why some crises and not others. And I will say, at least from the US government perspective, we are committed to being driven by need and by being a global donor. And so when we looked out, when we saw deepening food insecurity, when we were able to secure additional resources, we looked using that data from things like the Famine Early Warning System, from the IPC, looked at where were the 34 countries that were most vulnerable and were most likely to deteriorate, and that's where we invested, including in Haiti as one of the specific examples. ECHO last week had a Venezuela Solidarity Conference a couple of weeks before, brought donors together to look at the crisis in Central America, and really deserves a huge amount of credit for being a global donor. Germany is a global donor. The Ukraine war has brought new donors into the humanitarian project, and I think one of our projects is to make these global donors as well, to really look out at the world, look at where need is greatest, and bring resources to bear against those crises that we're most worried about. And I'll take advantage of having the microphone for one more second to say, as much as we've been focused in this conversation on Yemen, on Sudan, on Somalia, the latest from our famine early warning system is the threat of famine in Burkina Faso, which we haven't talked about today. And so again, we have much better kind of early warning alarms going off, and the key is really to use that for early action, if not anticipatory action.
Thank you very much. We have about 4 minutes left for our panel discussion, so 2 minutes from you to comment, perhaps to summarize or to answer the question, Rina Gilani.
Look, I agree with everything said, and I think the trick now is how we collectively take the challenges of our time and coordinate and come around it, you know, each of us taking responsibility for a component. For example, on prevention, on ODA, the last time we did analysis, I think it's now 2021, on the ODA, the development part of ODA,
Rina, could you put your microphone a bit closer? Thank you.
Sorry, too close. I heard someone mention the rapper move this morning. So 30% of the development part of ODA is going to the countries that are in food crisis today. 11% of that 30% is going to the sectors that we would say are the right sectors to help prevent that country sliding into further food insecurity. If we shifted the dial within the existing funds, even by 1 or 2% on that side, that already would make a major dent. So there are things at our disposal today that do not necessarily require governments to provide even more money. It's using what we have better. Anticipation, social protection, and really making sure we go to the right places in the right sectors.
Thank you. And can I just ask Ambassador Sasume to give 1 minute, please, of a comment on one thing, just 1 minute.
Yes, thank you. Il y a quelqu'un qui a parlé pourquoi 50 années derrière, aujourd'hui, on a les mêmes difficultés. Deux raisons. La nature des conflits ont changé. Ce sont des conflits qui se passent. Le Sahel aujourd'hui, les gens ne peuvent plus cultiver. Il y a un problème. Je prends aussi le cas de changement climatique. Ce n'était pas le cas avant. Aujourd'hui, on a ces difficultés. Ça fait que ça devient difficile de nourrir, de cultiver, de nourrir. Et la nature même du continent. Aujourd'hui, le continent africain compte 1,4 milliard d'habitants. Ce n'était pas le cas. Ce sont beaucoup de bouches à nourrir. Et avec les situations, les 4C, on se retrouve dans des difficultés. Et je suis d'accord, on doit mettre l'accent sur la prévention. Et aussi les solutions africaines. That's why we are creating African Humanitarian Agency to have a solution, African solution to African problem, to try to help also our member state. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being so brief and on time. Thank you very much. I'm going to now call Michael Kohler, Deputy Director General of DG ECHO, for some final thoughts. If you'd like to come up to the podium, please. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you all to the panelists for your views. Over to you now, Michael.
Thank you very much, Anya. And I think our panel has done a wonderful job in making a very complex subject even more complex. And I say this without any kind of, bad tongue or whatever, but probably this is the inevitable step in order to take another step, which is to come with solutions. And I'm so grateful to you, Rina, because you started to give us some solutions in your last remarks. But what have we understood? And actually, we are experts here. I think nobody here in the room is really utterly surprised. We have understood that we are dealing with an extremely complex phenomenon. I think, Jean-François, you get my personal prize for the best metaphor. You spoke about a terrible cocktail. A terrible cocktail. I think Sarah was slightly more scientific when she spoke about interconnectedness. But the French translation of interconnectedness is terrible cocktail, apparently. But joke aside, what we really saw is that we are witnessing a situation where layers and layers and layers of root causes are superseding each other, making the food security situation ever more difficult and ever more difficult to address. And therefore, I think the panel was a little bit hesitant in coming with solutions because there are no quick fixes. Rina spoke about, for example, we need to diversify imports, yes. Will that alone do the trick? No. The one thing that everybody here in the room seems to believe, and also the colleagues who are connected online, is that the present system doesn't do the trick. And therefore, we had this radical Slido statement in the beginning that, everything has to change. Well, we all know that you must not throw out the baby with the bathwater. So if you change intelligently. But change needs to be. Because if the food situation is basically a huge spaghetti bowl, where do you start? Where do you come? Should we start with the peace and then Jean-François is opting out? Should we start with humanitarian aid? But we all see that humanitarian aid is addressing just the superficial, the surface, but not the root causes. Where do we start? We know that the one solution that Alexander the Great used when he was faced with a similar dilemma, to take his sword and cut through the Gordian knot, that doesn't work in our case. So where do we start? And I think we gave some indications already. The first thing is that we need to know that humanitarian aid is not the only answer, but it is part of the answer. And it can buy time, obviously. So we need to be smarter with humanitarian aid. And actually, I would say that, yes, the international system has learned a couple of things since the 1970s, the question from our colleague from Haiti. Because although food insecurity is a big, big, big problem right now in the world, I do not think that we have the same degree of drama that we had in the 1970s. We don't have so many IPC5 crises right now, the Somalias, the Biafras of that time. We have many IPC3 and 4. And why don't we have IPC5s of that drama today? That is because our system has become more sophisticated. Our logistics, our WFP, for example, our stockpiling around the globe. So our way to cure the symptoms has become more efficient. But again, this cures the symptoms, not the root causes. So where to start? And I think some of the answers were given. Yes, we need to have more anticipatory action. Yes, we need to have more nexus. We need to have more shock-responsive social protection systems. We need to use more cash. We need to address the root causes. And we're doing it, but this is still not commensurate with the challenge. And I think the one question that we probably need to organize or to address at our next panel, so we are all already invited for a next edition, and I don't say only next year, it might even be earlier, is where to start. Where to start? Because maybe to come with a comprehensive solution is too complex. But if we could at least have a better articulation between the humanitarian and the development answer, the very embryo of the nexus, without even starting with peace, maybe that would already lead us a bit further than what we see today. In other words, I think what we need to do is, and I don't believe we have the analytical tools yet already, we need to look at every single food crisis with its own merits and come with a solution that is commensurate to the crisis, not a solution that simply is guided by the instruments that we have. It sounds banal, but all of us, we are dealing with humanitarian instruments. I am dealing with humanitarian instruments. I am not dealing with a crisis. Somehow we have to reverse the order if we want to do better justice to the people in need that we want to help. Thank you very much, Anja, for leading us so ably through this discussion.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much to all our panelists for their insights, and to the graphic artist for encapsulating so beautifully and simply some of the points that were raised. Thank you very much.